the idea is like, well, we should collect more. We see a virtual like buffet of data collection points that we could possibly ever ask. And if the answer is like, well, it could be useful maybe in the future, that's not good enough. That is not good enough for right now.
I'm Cassandra Hendricks. I use they, them pronouns. I am a data consultant on the data services team at MACC, which is the Metropolitan Alliance for Connected Communities. We are at the Data for Public Good conference speaking today about data justice in the human services sector.
I'm Alicia Ranney. I use she, her pronouns. I am from the Metropolitan Alliance of Connected Communities, where I'm the VP of Data and Evaluation. And we are here today at the Data for Public Good conference speaking about data justice.
Data justice to us is both looking at all of the data that is collected by human services, nonprofits, typically stipulated by their funding requirements and stuff. So, if you go in and you need a bag of food, you might be asked your gender identity, your name, the race of all of your kids, birth dates. Like, our lens is questioning that and pushing back on the requirements that end up falling most heavily on poor people. And we see that as like an extra tax on them. And so we want people to both be like thinking critically and advocating where we can to push back on those systems.
Yeah, I would add that data justice is really focused on the use of data and asking ourselves, well, what is it used? What is this used for? How can this be of service to the communities, to the work that we do, to further understand the challenges and problems that we face as a society? We take two main assumptions, or just the key talking points from our presentation today, is that like all data should be useful, and all data have costs. And that it's really important to weigh those two key aspects in all of our work, so that way we are not, I think like what you were sharing, Cassandra, is like we're not, wasting time, energy, and resources and causing harm for something that's going to get shelved, for something that's just there to check off a box. For something there that's nobody's really actually ever thought about, well, why are we collecting this information? We don't, but really trying to emphasize that if we are collecting information, it should be useful. It should should serve a goal of helping an organization, an institution, a people learn about the challenges that they're facing, or improve programming so that they're getting better services, and like just asking those critical features and questions.
When we say like tax on poor people, like human service organizations, we're talking about domestic violence organizations, organizations that help unhoused youth, food shelves and community centers, etc., a lot of which are predominantly used by folks who do not have access to those resources privately, right? So that is predominantly poor people. And when all of these data requirements are expected of, if you want housing, give me your full chemical dependency history in detail. Give me, all of the information, have you worked the last 52 weeks of this year? What were those jobs like? How much were you making? From some more basic stuff that feels like doing your taxes to can be very private. And like Alicia was saying, to end up in a database that's then going to get sent to a funder, these unknown locations necessarily, how is that going to come back and benefit those actual participants? And bringing a trauma-informed lens to that, right? Of if you were giving your data, you should have both access to it and a clear understanding of how this is going to benefit you. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something that we hear a lot within our world of working with so many human service organizations. It's just like, I think the folks, the staff that are frontline staff and working directly with folks are really trying their hardest to minimize that the number of times someone has to tell their story. And storytelling is powerful. It's important. It's a really important piece to help learn about challenges or support someone in kind of coming into their own. But when you're doing it in exchange for a basic need and you're doing it over and over and over again, and you know that you start to get the sense that nobody really is listening, right? Nobody really cares. But I will walk through these hoops because I really need to get, this rental assistance today, or I would really like to just figure out some options that I can do to get out of the situation I'm in for the next, next couple of weeks. What are my options? So there's an exchange that happens, and I think the important piece is that exchange is necessary. In some instances, you want to show compliance that you're actually working with a human being and that you're not just making up your information, right? But there should be something that goes beyond that. And then if it is just for compliance, then what is the bare minimum that should be requested of an individual to be able to show compliance that you did X, Y, and Z? And then what are the other parts that would be supportive to help them really gain autonomy and independence and choice? And then lastly, most importantly, and you alluded to this, Cassandra, is just like the importance of consent. Consent is so important, and we don't, in the United States, I think we're still at our earliest sort of time frame of understanding consent. Everybody likes to talk about HIPAA. HIPAA's fine. How many HIPAA consent forms have I filled out in my just doctor office and going to here? Yes, I'll sign them. But what does it mean when we're providing our data to just anyone? I mean, and this reaches out and this is where that sort of overlap of the rest of the sort of data justice ecosystem sits with this, is that whether it's an algorithm or AI or social media, we have gotten into this practice of giving our information away, and we don't know where it goes. But we definitely know it does often and sometimes does not end up in the places we want it to be. And that's that's something that we're investigating at a micro level, I would say, macro level, depending on how small you want to put human service nonprofits in. But it's something that in this sector over here, we're looking at and investigating and saying, we should do, what are the ultimate best practices that we can push forward as a sector and really elevate that, and then bring that forward from a human service nonprofit sector, not necessarily someone swooping in and saying, hey, maybe you should do it this way. And we're like, okay. But we're really trying to think about, well, all these folks have been working in the field, doing their work for decades, some of them, and they know what's best. There's a lot to learn. And I think that they know when there's this feeling of trauma-informed practices, and then collecting an inventory of information before you can even have a conversation about what they've showed up for is not a trauma-informed practice. And so we're just sort of thinking about that in ways in that we can bring that up and help build more partners and practitioners and bring along the larger institutions who are often asking for the data, into this conversation. And that's sort of I think ultimately where we're getting to today, but we're just doing an introduction to data justice today and building sort of an understanding of what that looks like and how it shows up into nonprofit human service organizations today.
Yeah, and one thing I would love to add is that we have seen good models of, there's an organization, for example, that has a survivors council made up completely of folks who have done or experienced sexual exploitation. They've done some type of sex work as youth, and inform what the intake looks like for that organization. And some of, working with funding requirements and stuff, but looking at the language that's used, how is that interview conducted, et cetera, informing that process. And that feels like a peek into what's possible, but is certainly not standard across organizations at this point.
Yeah, I think, we've talked a bit about what is data justice, and that's like, hopefully they're walking away with an understanding of what that looks like and how that shows up in our ecosystem, and maybe also coming away with ideas and maybe just a thread of inquiry into the avenues in which they're coming across similar practices, whether it's in a nonprofit human service organization or at their university or school, or maybe they go and they find themselves in philanthropy or in government. You can take this same line of inquiry into all of these different sectors and ask the same thing. Well, what is this data used for? What purpose does it serve? What are the participants' experiences as they are giving their information away? How is this being used? What decisions get made as a result? What actions are taking? And if they get to the decisions, actions, and or like we don't know, and the answer is I don't know, or we've just always done this way, we hope they maybe come away with some sense of an empowerment that says, well, maybe we shouldn't collect it. We hope they maybe come away with some sense of an empowerment that says, well, maybe we shouldn't collect it. If there's no purpose, if it doesn't have a direct action or decision related to it, maybe we should leave it aside and reduce that amount. It improves your data that you want to collect because you're then getting higher quality with less of a long stream of information. You're able to get more for the less data that you get than asking more data and then also throwing away half of it because you realize you don't really need it after all. I would say the other piece are just coming away from, like, with some ideas of inspiration. Cassandra mentioned the constituent groups as like one method of bringing in community to help interrogate and ask themselves, well, what would be useful for us? What do we want to learn? What would be helpful for us to know, and help those construct the inventories, the surveys, the intakes, the questionnaires that get collected. And then also we will hopefully come away with some ideas of like, well, how do I get started? Like, where do we begin? And because like you don't have to go start with like a really hard conversation with your grant partner, your government contact person about like what is data justice. You can just start with looking at your intake and reviewing some of these questions and asking yourself, well, do we still use this? Is this required? Could this be worded in a way that would be more supportive of an individual's identity and well-being? I think it's always important to ask, well, if you're a consumer or constituent or the recipient of like, can you please fill this out? Ask them, well, what is this used for? And you can kind of tell at that point if the staff person has had any other conversations about data justice and how connected they are even to that inventory or survey or intake. Because if they don't know, that's a common, unfortunately, just a common experience. But the more of us that can start asking ourselves, well, what is this used for? What decisions are going to be made with this information? Can I get a report back on this information? When could I expect it? Like, these simple questions will start to say like, oh, we should maybe think about these things as a community. We should come up with some decisions so we can be ready to answer these questions. Because I think we've collectively taken it for granted. I certainly have in my history. Like, wasn't born understanding data justice. I had a trajectory and a journey myself, and I think these are questions, though, that would have been helpful for me to hear years and years ago when I was, program manager and working with people. So,
yeah, and I think we've also seen collective action already taken that we can similarly look to as examples. Every time the census is collected, there is huge debate around the questions on the census, most recently the immigration question, citizenship question. And, even interrogating, like, what's on my driver's license? Like, do they actually need to know X, Y, and Z on this thing that I carry with me in order to drive a car? Like, regarding gender identity, even, etc. So both like looking to groups that have already been doing that work, and what we're doing too is we're not just talking about data justice. Like, we are working with data administrators at a lot of the human services nonprofits we work with. We've formed a cohort and are looking to have meetings with funders and like ask those questions, because a lot of times part of what our nonprofits experience is they receive the grant and then they see all the stipulations of like, oh yeah, and by the way, to get that $50,000, you're going to have to tell us all of these things and figure out how to collect that. So there are ways to push back, like individually, like you were saying, when you experience it as a consumer in a doctor's office, et cetera. But also, there are ways collectively of, what is your school asking if you're bringing your child in that they need to know about your kid? Like, is all of that information actually useful? How often is it being updated? Where is it being stored, et cetera?
Yeah. And when you see industry leaders that are actually doing good work, I think that movement around trust-based philanthropy, movement around offering more gen ops funding, I would love to see more folks in philanthropy just elevating like general organizational evaluation practices instead of a structured specific report back. They're like, well, if a portion of your funding goes back to the organization for evaluation, let that organization tell you what they want to learn about their work, but let all of the funds collectively help them do that work, not just do 1,500 different ways of learning about one specific thing that one funder is interested in, but use like sort of a gen ops model for evaluation learning and storytelling, so that way human service nonprofits can sort of focus their efforts. And we're seeing some of that. And so as constituents, as folks who are watching this, if you see that too, give that kudos, tell them they should keep doing that, and share those leaders out with other folks, so that way we can know who to look to as examples and mentors in this movement. I think we're in a moment right now, which makes all of this conversation super timely, where the rules haven't yet been made, for better, for worse. And I think that we have an opportunity here to think about what we're doing before we do it. And in sort of context of AI, in context of the large amounts of information that are given away and sometimes stolen and used just on the internet, like there's other pieces and avenues and groups in which data is also being collected. And it's not, I don't think, as egregious or scary as, say, like having, all of my banking data stolen and then finding it on the dark web, right? But it's part of that conversation. It's about us sort of almost aligning yourself as an individual with your data and say, this is a part of me. This is not something that's distinct from myself, my body, my identity. This is actually mine, because it's your data. And so I think that we have an opportunity at this moment to ask ourselves, well, what do we want to see? What world do we want to build with all of these technologies that we now have the opportunity to support us with? What ways do we want to ensure that we don't induce or cause harm or further harm? I think that all of these pieces are really important. I think for nonprofits too, I guess one last point is that I think we're slowly being ushered into an age of compliance-based reporting. And I think that there's like this fear that that human services are out to game the system, which is entirely untrue. There's been a couple of really notorious news stories as of late, but it is by far not even close to representative of the hard work and the community building efforts and the expertise and the people who are out there on the ground, like really holding our communities together in the challenging times with housing, healthcare, childcare costs, general uncertainty. You know, there we sort of MACC is representative of a network of groups of organizations that are doing a really good job and working so hard. And it isn't that they don't want to collect data. It's that they just want to do it so that, and ensure that they're actually learning something from that information, that it isn't just being taken for granted and given away or doesn't have a specific use. And I think that that's the opportunity that we're at right now.
Yeah, I would just add to that it's a moment also for solidarity. It feels like a lot of the concern around data, et cetera, right now is coming from people who haven't historically had all of their data collected, right? So we're talking about class in that, and if you have never used human services, because a lot of these data practices in human services, regardless of whether or not they've been in a database, the collection of it has been happening for a long time. So it's also, and these are folks who also have cell phones, are using apps, are using banks, et cetera. And how do we like widen the net and our lens of not just like resort to individual panic of like, oh no, my banking info, my, use of a store's website, et cetera, that got leaked. I went to the University of Minnesota and like got notified that my information got leaked. But that is obviously like being able to attend higher education is a massive privilege. And I didn't experience, it's not like my data was collected. Like some people have had their data collected by human services since they were a child. And so thinking about the like scope and breadth and that this is widening that net, like we want to push like wider to see who is all actually impacted at all the different levels, not just by, I think some of these like newer technologies.
Where's the intersections of privacy and data and what we need to get by? I mean, I think that there is a commodification of data. It's evident when we share that. Like, I mean, in essence, especially for compliance-based reporting, and especially kind of getting ushered into this sort of next icky era of being accountable, which I'm not, it's just like there's an exchange. So it's almost like data is a form of currency in exchange for basic things. I mean, we go to the grocery store right now and we can exchange currency, but like if I don't have enough money right now to pay my rent, I'm making some choices. I might go to the food shelf and I exchange my data for a bag of food. And so that organization exchanged data for actual currency so they can continue their work. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with compliance and accountability. I think that that is important. I think we just need to be specific and thoughtful of how much is necessarily required. And I think going back to your question though of like privacy, I think that we don't, that needs to shift, and it isn't something that gets talked about as much here in the US as it has in Europe and in other places around the world. Like that's where I was first found the concept of data justice was not in the United States, but it was in Europe, and it was like off of data justice website focusing on AI and social media and our data there. But I think like I don't think I have a way to button up that any closer to what you asked. But I think that there is like an importance of like understanding data as an extension of who you are, and that you have a right to that information. Someone just can't extract that and cut that away from you and say like, thanks, I'll take this from here. It does not become their property. It is still, it's about you. I mean, what is it? No data about us without us, right? I mean, and so if it's about you, if it's you, then you should have an inherent right to that data. And I don't think that we're all there. I think that we have a long way to go. And there's certain corporations and companies and folks in this world who think that, once you give it to me, it is mine, and I can do with it what I want. And I think that that's a fundamental framework that we need to push back against. I would say that, you want to say the motivation is well-intended. I think that there is an idea around being able to learn about a situation, understand a group of human beings, understand what challenges and barriers they're facing, so that way you can change the world and change that experience. But I don't think that that's the purpose of why human services exist. They exist as an important social safety net that is able to catch human beings in the face of systemic oppression and in face of society, in face of all of the factors that are weighing against human beings and communities in the world. And they are that safety net that we depend on. And I think the folks that provide important donations and funding opportunities are gearing towards, they don't want to see youth homelessness. They don't want to see people going hungry. They don't want to see folks who have to make hard decisions about, whether I should stay with this person who is unsafe for me and my family because it's a house, or whether I could go somewhere else, but I have nowhere else to go to. The folks who the intentions of human services are noble and important, and they fill an important void that we as a society just have. And I think data and information and learning it has just sort of organically grown of this we should collect some data on this. I think it has come from a sense of distrust. I think that goes back to the 80s, sort of Reagan era. People thinking that folks are there just to take advantage of the system. And they've got nothing else to do but take advantage of the system. And so you have to have data and compliance to make sure there's nobody taking advantage of the system. But I can tell you, that's a lot of work to do that, just to take advantage of a system, and that people are not arriving 9 times out of 10 because they want to get save money or get a free ride. That doesn't exist. They're there because this is an avenue that'll support them and finding better solutions in their lives that they don't have otherwise any other options to get. So it has been, I think, steeped in accountability, proving that the people that you're working with have enough problems to justify the dollars that are getting spent. And I think the movement of trust-based philanthropy is seeking to flip that. And that data justice is part of that conversation there of we actually trust our human service organizations with the resources to make the decisions about what programming they think is most necessary to have. And I think we can also trust that if they had the resources to funnel all of that information into real evaluation and learn about what ways they could improve their programming. There was a question, I think, from the last Data for Public Good conference that has stuck in me. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, but the group that was on stage had shared that instead of asking the participants what barriers they face in life, they asked their participants, well, what barriers do you see in our programming that are keeping you from succeeding? Because we all have barriers and challenges, right? But what are those barriers in programming and services that are keeping you from succeeding? If we could invest all of that time, effort, and resources into that, we would have some of the most amazing programming out there. I mean, it's still amazing, but it'd be even better, I think, in terms of being able to have that understood. And then how can we shift that back to the community, so that they can have a piece of that as well? I think a shift in the paradigm of just because you can collect it doesn't mean that it is useful. Just because if you could collect more data doesn't mean it would be helpful. And I think that those things, just because it's a new shiny AI that can look at your data in new ways, doesn't mean it will actually improve your programming. And so, like, I think, like, as we've had more databases, as that's become more of a practice, especially in human service organizations around the world, right? You know, the idea is like, well, we should collect more. You know, we see a virtual, like, buffet of data collection points that we could possibly ever ask. And if the answer is like, well, it could be useful maybe in the future, that's not good enough. That is not good enough for right now.
And I would just add that the government entities that fund so much of this, right? Because when we talk about funders, we're like talking about the government, whether it be like county government, state government, as like a huge piece of it. Those offices also have to constantly defend the amount of funding they have. Like, it is, human services are incredibly politicized in the society we currently live in. And there is the idea that, like, the more data we have, the more storytelling we can do, then, like, that'll, like, keep us securing the funding. And we don't do that with a lot of other sectors. And it is, like, a very big question to, like, push back on all of us with, of why do we make people who are in crisis and in need, like, defend that need?
Well, my dream, and I think I've alluded to this a little bit, is that nonprofit human service organizations get funding to invest in their data collection practices to ensure that it's useful and being used, and that they have potentially funding and resources to be able to bring together their constituencies and their communities that they're working with to be informed, to educate themselves about the challenges and issues that they're up against, and bring forward ideas that are that could be supportive to that programming, and that potentially, you know, the future human service nonprofit is getting paid for all of the different avenues of work that help meet their mission. And then there's a source of funding that ensures that they can do an organizational evaluation that's not being split, sliced, and diced apart into 500 different funding streams, which is the current case, and then retranslated and reinterpreted to meet this funder need and this funder need and this funder need and that funder need. But and then they don't, that's where all of the time, energy, and resources is going right now. In the future, I think it's where they can be able to have, like, this is our organizational report, all of my 50 funders here, this is the report I did. I'm not changing what we did just for your eyes, but thank you for your funding. So you made our programming work this year, and this is what we did with it. This is what we learned. This is what didn't work. This is what we're going to change in the future as a result. That type of learning is such a privilege to be able to do, and doesn't happen enough right now. But in the future, I think that's a place of where data justice is.
Yeah, thank you. I would just build on that. And when we talk about direct human services, we're talking about care, right? We're talking about you're fleeing a situation and, like, you need to receive care in like facing that crisis. And that care is child care. That care is, like, having one-on-ones with someone who can, like, talk with you, therapy, etc., all of those things. And we're talking about all of these different spaces for people to receive care around their basic needs. And what I would love to see is that we, like, get back to that vision and fund it fully, and that it's trust-based, like you were alluding to. Like, what if we trusted our case managers, that they had the conversations they said they did, and that the participants are who they say they are, that they are experiencing what they say they're experiencing. And that, what we see currently is so many organizations, like the data is like a curmudgeon-y, like, ugh, and then I have to like go do all my case notes and I have to like put all of this data in about these people. Like, no one goes to school for that. No one is like excited about doing any of their social work, like that piece of it. But it could be. It doesn't have to be that. Like, what if it was actually really exciting to see, and there was autonomy in that. That's a little like vague, but I think that the like curiosity and like getting back to the vision of, well, what is all of this for in the first place? And like refocusing all of us, because like, what if all of that sprawl that you're talking about of like, the compliance reports have to go to someone who has to look at it, and that's an office. Like, those resources could be going elsewhere,
Yeah.
right? Like, those resources could actually just go to the work, go to participants, go towards housing stabilization. And I think those questions are both important to ask and push back on.
So if you want to learn more about this important work, I think folks can check out our website. We're at mac-mn.org. You can Google data justice and MACC, and you can get brought to our data justice page. And then we are going to be having a week of action this September, Data Justice Week of Action, with TCIA and MACC are co-sponsoring this through our Data Justice Futures initiative, and we'll be having website information go live, I think, in the next week. I don't have a webpage for you just yet, though.
Yes. And on that will be our data justice report that we're releasing as well.